Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're really fortunate to have Adriana Martinez, professor of geography and environmental science at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Didi, thank you so much for showing up today.
Thanks for having me.
As I discuss with many people coming on this program, I ask them to reflect upon their childhood, their upbringing, to consider perhaps any catalysts that might have sparked interest in geography growing up, and then to discuss undergraduate and graduate studies. Would you care to share?
Absolutely. So I would say it started when I was a kid. I grew up in South Texas, in Eagle Pass, Texas, right on the border with Mexico. And my parents own about an acre of property, and it has a creek running through it. And really, it's a canal. But it kind of took the form of a creek, and I grew up playing on that creek. So I would take my toys down there, right, with my sister. I have a twin sister. And my parents just really instilled in me a love for the outdoors. We spent a lot of time outdoors. My dad always encouraged us to play with different types of toys, right? Not just the girl toys, but he would buy us little bulldozers and things, and we like to move dirt around, soil around. I just liked spending time in nature. And then, of course, growing up right on the border, the Rio Grande is right there. And it really is an area that's a mesh of two cultures. So both, my Mexican American side, but also I have some Scottish and German background as well. And so I kind of grew up in this rich environment that had both an environmental focus for me, but also a cultural focus. And when I was in high school, I took an AP environmental science class that my sister convinced me to take. I didn't want to take it at first, but she said, this is going to be fun. And so I did, and it really changed my life. I hadn't ever really had a subject I was particularly interested in, and I was a senior in high school. And I took this course with the teacher, Mr. Randy Lawrence, and he took us outside, and we started doing science outside, which I had no idea was something that you could do. So we went out to the Rio Grande, we did water sampling, right? We went out to the Gulf of Mexico, and we did seining in the ocean. It would just open my eyes to a whole new realm of possibilities. And so I went to Texas A&M University, and my major was actually environmental geosciences. And so I spent 4 years taking courses like oceanography, geography, right, physical geography courses, geology. And one of the courses I took towards the end in my senior year was a hydrology course that was taught by a fluvial geomorphologist. And I found that fascinating, right? And it sort of harkened back to my time growing up on that little creek and on the Rio Grande. And so I really found out I really like studying rivers. I really enjoy understanding geomorphology, right? And how rivers and other things like glaciers and waves form landscapes. And so the professor teaching that course said, "Hey, I heard you want to go to grad school. So do you want to work with me?" And so I said yes, and I stayed on there at A&M to do my master's in geography. And so that's really how I ended up switching into geography, kind of from the environmental science, environmental geosciences realm. So that's when that first began.
Would you care to comment on geographers that you had interactions with at A&M?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of my favorite professors were people like Dr. Andrew Klein, Dr. Sarah Bednarz, Dr. Vache Chakarian. Dr. Chakarian was the first geomorphology class I took. And he would stand up at the front of the lecture hall and jump around like a saltating grain. And it's just, sediment transport fascinated me. And that was sort of the first time I realized that I really enjoyed studying how the landscape is shaped by, moving water, by glaciers. And so I found that really interesting, and I pursued that. And then Dr. Chakarian was also just incredibly supportive in other ways too. I would meet with him. He would advise me on the courses to take. And he wrote recommendation letters for me to go study abroad in New Zealand. So it was moments like that with professors at A&M that really made me feel like I was at home in geomorphology.
That's wonderful. And so you were at A&M, you were considering, what made you decide to pursue a doctorate?
Yeah, so during my first year at A&M, I TA'd for that hydrology class that I took with that professor. And I really enjoyed teaching at the college level. And I come from a family of people in education. My dad was an elementary school teacher. He's retired now. My mom was an elementary school teacher aide. She's also retired now. My sister teaches 7th grade science. So it wasn't outside, the realm of possibility that I'd end up in education. And it, teaching that hydrology class really opened up my eyes to like, oh, I really enjoy this. I enjoy teaching at this level. And so I knew while I was worried about pursuing a PhD and how hard that would be, I knew that if I really wanted to teach at the college level, that was what was needed. So I worked with my thesis advisor to identify a couple of programs, and I ended up at the University of Oregon once I visited there. And I chose that particular place both because of the advisors I'd be working with, including Dr. Pat McDowell and Dr. Andrew Marcus. But also because they had a large cohort of students that were also doing river studies. And so they were, at the time I joined, probably 6 or 7 graduate students working on fluvial geomorphology. And, 6 out of the 7 pretty typically were women. And I think that was really due to Pat and the amazing advising that she did. She's retired now. And so I was just really drawn to that, right? We don't see many women in the physical sciences, particularly in geomorphology. And it was nice to have both a cohort of students, but also a cohort of women that were working on their PhD or their master's in rivers.
And so you were engaged in some field work, really, in the vicinity of beautiful downtown Chiloquin and the Sprague River. How was it like to be a woman working in this very isolated, relatively remote place?
It was very interesting, right? But that is often what happens, particularly when you're in that eastern part of Oregon. So I did my work on the Sprague River near Chiloquin, but I also helped other students, right, other faculty members, particularly out in eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, portions of Idaho. So, they would help me with my dissertation fieldwork. I would help them with theirs. And it was really interesting, right? We'd get a lot of strange looks when we went into the restaurant wearing field clothes, really muddy, 3 women. Because we had this amazing cohort of women, often my field helpers were women also, right? And so they, what are these women doing? They're all wearing muddy clothes and, they got caps on and, they're carrying equipment around. I remember one time in particular that I had 2 field assistants go with me, one a fellow woman student and one another male student. And one of the property owners, right, you have to negotiate with property owners to get access to the river. And he was like, oh, are you here to tell them what to do? And the friend of mine was a major in the Army, and he turned to him and he said, no, she's going to tell me what to do. I was the one that knew where we were going to sample and how we were going to do the sampling and things. And so occasionally we'd get, things like that happening. But, for the most part, it was a really empowering experience, particularly with Pat. We'd go out into the field with Pat. She was the first advisor I'd ever had that, said, hey, I'm going to take you out into the field. Like, let's go find a field site. Let's see where you want to do your dissertation, right? She spent day after day in the field. I worked for her on some of the grants out on the Middle Fork John Day in Eastern Oregon, and she was right there with us and she enjoyed the field. She was in her element. And so I got to really see that modeled for me and how much fun she had, right? It made it fun for me because I'm also in my element when I'm doing that field work.
Well, certainly field work is a wonderful thing to engage in for not only physical geographers, but those on the human side as well who seek to engage in an understanding of the landscape. But let's continue to talk a little bit more about your dissertation research, because I find it fascinating where you're examining really the impact of this invasive species of Phalaris.
Yeah, I found it interesting. I really liked the connection between ecology and geomorphology. And I feel like as a geographer, we can do a lot of things like that, right? We can cross those boundaries of biology, ecology, geomorphology, geology, right? I have friends that are biogeographers, but friends that are also human geographers. And so it's not just what is the sediment doing on its own, right? Or how might the river be moving that sediment, but it's how is the ecology of the river itself interacting with that sediment, interacting with the water flow. And I think that nexus is really where things get interesting. And so that's why I studied vegetation in the river for my dissertation. So I find that fascinating.
And if I'm not mistaken, you indicated that perhaps not all invasions of exotic species or those non-native species to a particular ecoregion or ecotone are necessarily going to have negative or harmful consequences. They might actually facilitate a higher level of physically environmental development that would be more conducive to aquatic life as well as a healthy river in itself.
Yeah, it really depends on the system you're looking at. And in particular, the Sprague River was interesting because it does not naturally have quite a lot of riparian trees around. In fact, Pat used to tell this story of some landowner that had gotten like a small grant to plant a bunch of willows along the Sprague River, thinking, right, willows are pretty typical of riparian areas, but they didn't survive because it just wasn't the right environment for it, right? The flooding regime of the Sprague River, it's a really wide floodplain area, right? It goes over bank quite often, and it's fairly natural, and it's naturally just does not have those tree species. And so that's one of the reasons why I chose that river, because the grass was so dominant. Otherwise, right, willow or some other riparian species would have been more dominant in that area. And it really depends on the length of time that it's there, right? What species in particular it's out competing or what rate that's working at. And that's true too for a project that I'm doing now on the Rio Grande, where there's an invasive cane that has taken over, right, for decades along the bank. And in a lot of cases, they've removed that cane for homeland security purposes, right, to prevent immigration. And that's caused massive amounts of erosion occurring. And so in that case, right, having the cane in place prevents that erosion from happening. And the erosion is way worse than having an invasive cane in there. But I've sort of gotten ahead of myself there with more current research.
Well, that is fascinating. And I really appreciate you taking the time to really ponder that kind of research, because it's very important. And it's in some ways, I guess I could ask you, is it bring to mind that maybe this is an offshoot of some of your earlier research concerning the barriers on the border and the impact on the environment?
Yeah, it's sort of funny how things come full circle, right? You kind of end up seeing connections, decades later, at least a decade later, when you're working on these sorts of things. But the work on the border that I've done has actually been a long time coming as well. And again, one of the things that I really like about being a geographer. And so I first started my border work actually because I was taking a class at Oregon. The PhD program required that you take a seminar in human geographer. So if you were a physical geographer, you take a seminar in human, which I appreciated. And so I took a course with Susan Hardwick, who, was amazing and became, as a result, became an amazing mentor of mine. Yes. And she had spent some time in Texas. And so when I had, moved to Oregon, was in Eugene for the first time, she really embraced me and said, "Oh my goodness, it must be so different for you here. Like, I'm here to help you." And so she did, she really embraced me, and I took that class, and the seminar was on migration. And so I approached her and I said, "Hey, what if I do my term project on the border fence?" Because when I had applied for Oregon and then started moving to Oregon in September of 2008, there was no border fence in my hometown. But when I went home for Thanksgiving, the fence was up, right? They were constructing it. And so I had thought that, this is not going to happen. That just seems silly, right? Most people on the border know that a fence won't work. It's not going to really accomplish the goals that they think it's going to. And yet here they were building the fence and it was in place. And so I went home and I did some interviews with locals and asked them, like, do you think that the fence is going to have an impact? How much do you think it will deter undocumented immigrants from coming over? And then, in fact, I went over into Mexico and I spoke to some undocumented immigrants that were preparing to make the journey over, and asked them, are you discouraged because of the fence? And they said, of course, no. And so Susan asked me, do you want to publish that paper? And so she and I had a co-authored paper on that.
In Focus.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And so it's fun. I will always treasure that I have a co-authored paper with her. And so, since then, it's kind of always been in the back of my mind. A few years later, I published a 5 years post the fence being in place. Do people still feel like it's not very useful? And the large answer was no, it's not very useful still. And then, I got tenure. And once I got tenure, I felt like I could experiment a little bit more with the research that I was doing. And so I began modeling the flood impacts of the fence, right? Sort of moving away from the human geography side and going to the physical geography side to actually see, like, if I can computer model if the fence is causing the floods to move in different directions, right? Exacerbate flooding in certain locations. And so I didn't really know if that was going to be possible, if it was able to be modeled, right? What sort of results I would get, would they be publishable? So I really kind of tackled that after tenure. And so I have published a couple of articles looking at how the fence and other infrastructure that they've put along the river has affected flooding in that area, particularly in my hometown of Eagle Pass.
Mm-hmm. Incidentally, you must be aware that your early research that was done with Susan, it was noted in Susan's regional geography textbook of the U.S. and Canada.
It was, yeah. She has a picture in there that my sister took, and we did a little write-up. Yep, that's right. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about your current research, because you do have your fingers in a number of different things. Can you talk about some other aspects of your research?
Yeah, so more recently now, I've done other studies looking at like a dam in Utah, an estuary in San Diego, but mostly these days I'm concentrating more on the border. So my more recent research is looking at the buoys. And so last July, almost a little bit over a year ago, they placed these large orange buoys along the river, at first in the very middle of the river. It's 1,000-foot long string of buoys.
And this was Texas state government, right?
Yes, that's true. Yes. So the governor of Texas placed these buoys. Imagine like big yoga balls, right? A string of giant yoga balls strung along the length of the river in the middle of the channel. They very quickly had to move them away from the middle of the channel because they were told that is partly in Mexico. So they're kind of now more on the US side slightly. To deter undocumented immigrants. And I knew immediately, right, as a fluvial geomorphologist, the impact that those buoys were going to have on the river. And then, of course, as a local, knowing that they were not really going to impact immigration in any substantial way, such that the damage they would be doing would have any effect. And so in addition to the buoys that last July, when they placed those, they also leveled about 4 or 5 different islands along the river. And one of the islands upstream of Shelby Park, which is where the boat ramp is located, was just completely connected back to the mainland, right? So now it's no longer an island. And then they just leveled it of vegetation. And the idea there from law enforcement was that they wanted to clear those areas so that they could see undocumented immigrants trying to cross. But of course, we know as geomorphologists, right, that if you remove vegetation, something I've studied at length along river channels, that sediment becomes exposed to that water flow, right? And so that could have a whole host of problems that end up coming about, right? When you mobilize sediment, you have water quality issues that could potentially come up. That means that, right, you're affecting the primary source of drinking water for the entire border region. So that's an issue there too, right? They've removed that invasive cane. And so that's caused quite a bit of erosion. And then now, as of about June, I saw some pictures of the buoys, and there is grass growing in the buoys. And so the buoys were kind of placed on top of a small mid-channel bar that's kind of really only exposed at very low levels, but it is sort of a shallower area within the channel. And so what's happening is the water is not flowing in its natural pathway. And so the buoys are slowing down that water. And when that water slows down, sediment deposits and grass starts growing, right? As soon as that sediment is exposed, you start getting vegetation that forms. And then, of course, that vegetation encourages more sediment deposition because it's also blocking that water. And so I'm really looking forward to being able to go soon out to the buoys again. I have plans to go to do some sediment sampling within the buoys themselves to see what different types of sediment, right, sediment sizes are depositing within that grass, the grass patches, but also on either side of the buoys and in the channel.
Would you expect there to be a higher level of salinity then near the mouth of the Rio Grande because of these aberrations that have been human-induced farther
Yeah.
upstream?
Yeah, and I mean, there's been several cases where the Rio Grande itself doesn't make its way to the Gulf anymore because we have, dammed up those waters. There's canals that the water's been diverted to. So absolutely, right. We have a lot of cases where that might be possible. And in those regions closer to the Gulf, right, we also have border fence present in those places too, right? And they can cause that, those sections can cause geomorphic differences to occur too. And of course, right, there's a lot of things to look at here, particularly as a geographer. We have climate change, and that's going to cause more severe and more frequent hurricanes, which means we're going to get those hurricanes, tropical storms that are making their way up from the Gulf to that border region in the Brownsville, right, McAllen area, but could come all the way up sometimes to Eagle Pass, right? And so or flooding that could happen. There are things like that I think a lot about is like, what if we do have a flood that's not anticipated and if the buoys are not properly installed, which I believe they're not, they could become dislodged, right? And suddenly they're floating downstream and they hit a bridge pier, right? Or some sort of other infrastructure that's happening because, right, we have these increased flooding possibilities with climate change. So there's just a lot to think about in that region.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've mentioned the cane, you've mentioned these buoys. Are there other impacts that you're studying in the border region that are worth a few minutes of discussion?
Yeah, and I'm always talking to people in the region, right? Wanting to connect. One of my goals is also to connect with individuals on the Mexican side as well, to sort of see what their viewpoint is, to see what's going on there. Another thing I hadn't mentioned too is that Operation Lone Star, which is the state system that's been sort of creating all this infrastructure, also placed these empty containers along the bank. And so you can imagine, right, empty train car containers just sitting very close to the edge of the bank, meant to form a sort of fence as well. And so I'm interested in what impact that's having, right? Essentially, they're acting almost like a levee, that you're, creating these much higher banks on either side, which could channelize water and make that water really shoot through the channel, causing, higher velocity, more sediment erosion. So I'm interested in that. I've also, on the times where I've gone down the river, they have that concertina wire everywhere, right? It's all along the banks. You can't walk up to the river anymore. You'll meet multiple layers of concertina wire. And I've of course seen that concertina wire that has become disconnected from the bank and is in the middle of the channel, right? With clothes and trees and stuff stuck in it, right? And that could have an ecological impact on the area too. So I'm always thinking about these things, right? But as geographers, we're kind of looking at, how are humans interacting with this area? How are they using this area? How are they gaining access? And what sort of impacts could these infrastructure pieces that the state is putting in have?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very important that you're engaged in this kind of research, as well as the field work that's associated with interviewing or talking with people on both sides of the border. What are your impressions from talking with people on one side versus the other side? Can you comment on that? With regard to these efforts to create barriers.
Yeah, I think that for the most part, people don't understand why they would choose those particular measures in order to deter immigrants. There is some fear around that because we have seen large numbers of immigrants coming through. And so, people don't want those to necessarily, be walking through town, right? Or if there's large groups that are sort of up to no good, right? That there is some fear in Eagle Pass and along the border regions. But for the most part, too, they understand the plight of those immigrants, right? Many of us, including me, comes from family of immigrants, both from Mexico, but also from Scotland. And so, we understand that perspective as well. And then one of the themes that comes up too is that it's really a border community, and we are these two towns across the river. So it's Eagle Pass, and then across the river is Piedras Negras, which is a much bigger city. And we're used to having, this crossover constantly happening, right? We have festivals. There's a friendship festival that happens every year, and there's a carnival on the banks of the river at Shelby Park. And that can't happen right now because they've fenced that off, right? And it's supposed to be a city park, and they're just not allowed to access that. There's an abrazo ceremony, right? A hug ceremony where the East town of Eagle Pass picks a person, and the city of Piedras Negras picks a person, and they walk to the center of the bridge and hug to sort of symbolize that connection that the two communities have. And so that infrastructure just really speaks against that, right? It doesn't send the same message. And often that infrastructure is coming from further up north, right? Somewhere in Austin, right? Or people that don't live on the border or don't live in Texas that think like, no, we should build these really big walls. And there are other ways to do this, right? And there was legislation that can help with this, right? We can negotiate with Mexico so that they're also deterring people from coming into their southern border. Because largely, right, you'll have people that are saying like, we got to keep those Mexicans out, but in the most cases, they're not Mexican. And I've spoken to these immigrants, right? I was on the river this past December, and I'm stopped, and I'm standing on a little bar right next to the buoys. I'm taking my measurements, and a man comes up and he talks to me, and he says, where he's from, and that he needs help, and I start talking to him, and of course I can't help him, and I'm really apologetic, and he says, I completely understand. So we put faces to these people, right? They're seeking asylum. And so I think that's, there's just a lot of conflicting things that are going on. But I would say that the overriding theme for locals is that, we want this connection. And there are other ways other than infrastructure to sort of keep things manageable without, completely denying those that are trying to seek asylum or a better life.
Well, certainly. There's something to be said for our concern for humanity, and there is also something to be said for being able to reach out with open arms to those that are seeking help if we can provide it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you don't really sort of realize that unless you're in the moment seeing those people, right? We were launching our boats off to go downstream, and there was a group of probably like 50 people from Venezuela. And we were kind of yelling at them to see, in Spanish, how long had they been walking? And they had been walking for 2 months, and they, were being escorted by Border Patrol. So they had been essentially caught. But they were so happy, right? They had reached the US after 2 months of walking, taking trains and things. So it's just really being on the ground. You really see that impact, and you sort of see the reality of the situation.
Well, the U.S. is a desirable location, and there is reason for immigration to the U.S. to occur, and there's reason for the U.S. to have a sound immigration policy and to embrace immigrants if they are able to be willing, if they're able and willing to be contributing, I guess,
right,
in some ways. And I guess also, we look at this matter of remittances. It may be one of the more effective forms of foreign aid we can engage in as well.
Yeah. And I think we need people, right? I think about college, right? I'm a university professor. We always want more enrollments. Like, hey, we aren't having as many kids as we used to. I'd appreciate some 18-year-olds enrolling in my classes, so I'll take them anytime.
Speaking of your classes, do you have a large number of traditional students and non-traditional students? How is it balanced at SIU Edwardsville?
Yeah, I would say primarily traditional students, a lot of, rural Illinois students, but also students that come from St. Louis. So I would say mostly traditional students at the undergraduate level with a smattering of non-traditional. And then the graduate students typically are working full time. And so it's a really neat population, right? They're really interested in getting that graduate degree, and they're focused, on gaining a particular skill, right? Or that particular, push so that they can advance in their careers.
Certainly. Let's shift now a little bit. You've been elected national counselor to the AAG, one of around 20 or so people that will, cast votes to determine the trajectory, really, of academic geography in the U.S., maybe the world. What do you suppose you can claim is a contribution that you'd like to pursue or make, as a member of council?
Yeah, so I was honored to be selected, and one of the reasons I ran was because I really want there to continue to be a focus at AAG within geography around DEI issues. And so that's been a huge focus of mine, particularly since tenure. I really focus on obtaining grants that can fund undergraduates and graduate students to pursue college education when they are minoritized. And I think geography in particular has a low representation of minoritized individuals. And so I think we can really benefit from that, right? And we study cultures, right? And we study locations all over the world. And so it's an area that of course makes sense for students. But again, like most geographers, right, they just don't know geography exists. They don't know that they can study rivers, right? They don't know that they can study these different topics that we end up doing. And so I hope to contribute to AAG in that sense. On the one hand is the DEI focus. And with Gary Langham and Risha, they've just really been working towards that. And that's a real goal of theirs. And so I've found that their leadership in that makes me feel hopeful for what they're doing. And I really want to be a part of that and help that along. And then secondarily, I also want to have representation for both the cultural work that I'm doing and the type of work that I'm doing, and particularly like the location of the work that I'm doing, right? Nobody else is studying the border region and how the fence and border militarization is affecting the river or the culture in the area. And so I like to represent that, right, and let people know that somebody is doing that type of work. And so that's really important to me. I like representing an institution of my type. So SIUE is a teaching institution, and we have a graduate program in geography, but it's not your R1 typical research university. But there are a lot of students here. There are a lot of professors that are doing really good work. And so I want to remind geographers, right, that these smaller schools have a big place in AAG, right, to advance geography, to get geography out there. And then again, my work is really applied. And so, it's a very specific study, right? This militarization, particularly in Texas, but all along the Rio Grande and the US-Mexico border. And so I think that's really important to get out there too. And because it's so applied, right, it doesn't fit the typical NSF definition of things, but it's incredibly important for people to know what's happening on the border, to know, what are the effects, for example, of these buoys, because we don't want the buoys to be placed all along the border, right? When they went up, you had, internet trolls saying, yeah, they should place them all the way from El Paso down to Brownsville, right? No, we can't do that, right? We can study what the effect of this 1,000-foot string of buoys is so that we can prevent that from happening, because we know that it'll have implications on the river and the people that live there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really interesting. Your work is really at the interface of society and the environment, and it really exemplifies, I think, in many ways, what our discipline is all about, and it's wonderful. And you're taking a position now in the AAG that enables you to bring a voice to not only your kind of institution, which until recently has been significantly outnumbered among the leaders in the discipline, in council and elsewhere, but also in academia in general. Usually it's the R1s that are the decision makers that everyone else has to follow. But you're also engaged in some very, very profound research. I'm going to ask you about this role that you have now. Would you care to comment on your role really as a leader in this area? Because whether you recognize it or not, you're playing a role as a leader, whether it's formal or informal.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think of myself in that sense, though I think I'm growing into that place over time. And it's, being a Latinx woman that went to university very far away from my hometown, I've always felt like I didn't belong. And so I felt like I didn't belong, as an undergraduate, as a graduate student. In some cases, there are a lot of spaces that I don't belong today, right? That people aren't inclusive in. And so I just hope to make things more inclusive, right? And serve as an example. And much like my advisor, Pat, modeled being a woman in the field, right? I want to model being a woman in the field, being a Latinx person in the field, right? Being in science, being in a STEM discipline. And so I definitely am stepping into that leadership role. And it's a process and you'll always get there, but I want to be a good leader, right? And I think that the people that make the best leaders are the ones that didn't have a necessarily privileged place, right? It's the people that did struggle, right? That had people reach out to them and say, hey, I want to help you take this next step, right? Those are the people that are going to have that real empathy to help the people that are behind them, right? And not close those doors behind them so that others can come through those too. And so I think about that quite a lot, particularly as I've gone up for a full professor and I got that. I've just been thinking about that all along, right? That's just something that I think about all the time. I think about the students. I think about the Latinx women students that I advise, and how important it is for me to model that and make sure that other people come through the door after me.
Indeed. Well, we have just a minute or two to go here, Dee Dee, and I'm going to ask you to reflect upon the path that you've trod, which you've indicated, you often do. And I'll ask you to think about what advice you might give to students, undergraduates who might be interested in geography but don't know what it's all about, to graduate students working on their research, to colleagues in the field. Would you care to share some insight?
Yeah, I think geography is a place where you can really explore a lot of different things. So if you've always found that you're that person that's interested in this and interested in that, geography can really provide that nexus. And so I would encourage them to take a look at what geography offers, right? Take some classes, talk to some professors that you might be interested in working with. And then particularly for minoritized students, I would say, that it's, college, pursuing, those things that perhaps previous generations didn't pursue is going to be hard, right? And I think I learned a lot, particularly in the last year, about how, you think that you'll make the next step. And as soon as you get your bachelor's degree or graduate degree, like you'll feel like you belong. But that's not necessarily going to happen because there just aren't spaces like that. But we need to make those spaces. And I'm here to make that space for them. And I'm here to help them through that process so that we eventually do get there. And I think geography is uniquely positioned to both do a diversity of research, but also welcome a diversity of students, right? Practitioners, professionals.
Dee Dee, thank you so very much. It has been a pleasure chatting with you today. I'm sure that you are going to be providing a lot of students with insight as they view this video stream or listen to the podcast. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
And this now concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.